This chart shows the U.S. debt to GDP ratio crossing the 100% threshold. Extending the timeline back reveals a sharp, temporary peak during World War II, unlike today's permanent structural deficit. The public debt sits at $31.27 trillion, projected to hit $53 trillion by 2036. This math is triggering real-world alarms in the global markets and eroding institutional trust in American fiscal stability. Moody's recently downgraded the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA1, a direct consequence of political and fiscal instability preventing debt control. Former officials from the International Monetary Fund warned that these trends are driving down the dollar and setting the stage for a severe financial crisis. The core drivers behind this expanding deficit are persistent tax cuts, massive interest payments, and the rising cost of entitlement programs for an aging population. The United States can no longer simply outgrow its debt. These structural deficits are forcing a total audit of all federal spending priorities. To see how this squeeze limits government function, look at this bar chart comparing net interest, defense, and Medicare. Net interest payments have crossed the $1 trillion mark. Servicing past debt now consumes more capital than defending the nation or elderly healthcare. This massive interest burden is locked in by central bank monetary policy and prolonged high yield rates. Carrying this much debt at these rates directly threatens long-term military readiness and domestic stability. Because the state is running out of unconditional capital, it has no choice but to implement strict, value-based capital allocation models to survive. This macroeconomic squeeze is now forcing major policy shifts at the micro level. Higher education is the prime case study. The 1965 Higher Education Act under Lyndon B.
Johnson launched the Access Era, assuming that expanding college enrollment inherently promoted economic growth. By the 1990s and 2000s, rapidly rising tuition costs forced a pivot to the Affordability Era. But the Affordability Era only eased repayment terms and ballooned federal lending, like the 2005 Grad Plus loans, without questioning the underlying price. The 2010s brought the Completion Era, assuming graduation was the sole metric of success, ignoring post-grad economic realities. Elite institutions actively resisted measuring financial return on investment, claiming that education cannot be measured in dollars and cents. These three eras created a system generating massive federal debt without guaranteeing a proportional economic return for the taxpayer or student. Now, a new mandated organizing principle has taken hold: value. Value asks a Bruton-specific question: does the economic return actually justify the initial federal investment? Rising sovereign debt levels are driving the federal government to replace unconditional educational subsidies with value-based accountability. Value-based accountability became federal law with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA. The core mandate of the OBBBA is that university programs must explicitly do no economic harm to maintain their access to federal student loans. This line graph establishes the baseline metric used to calculate that harm, the median earnings of a 25 to 34-year-old high school graduate in the exact same state. A specific university program's median graduate earnings are mapped as a counterfactual against this high school baseline. If a program's earnings fall below the high school baseline for 2 out of any 3 consecutive years, it fails the test. The consequence is immediate. The program entirely loses access to the federal student loan system. The OBBA establishes a performance floor, targeting only the lowest performing programs rather than defining institutional excellence. This mechanism enforces dual discipline. It acts as micro-level consumer protection for students and macro-level fiscal protection by cutting off capital to programs that destroy economic value. A strict economic ROI model immediately raises concerns about socially vital but historically low-paying professions. Fields like social work and teaching risk losing federal loan access if their typical graduates fail to clear the OBBA threshold. It is inherently predatory to saddle public servants with unpayable debt just to enter the workforce. States can solve this through licensing reform, eliminating the requirement of expensive graduate degrees for these roles. If states demand those degrees, they must offer direct subsidies, tax credits, or higher public sector wages, rather than hiding the true cost inside federal loans. True value-based accountability forces society to transparently fund public goods directly, rather than weaponizing federal student debt to subsidize a broken system. Zooming out from higher education brings us back to the macroeconomic stakes of the United States. Returning to the Congressional Budget Office projection chart, the debt-to-GDP ratio is curving toward 120%, projecting a $53 trillion debt by 2036. To prevent this insolvency, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has proposed an alternative plan. Their target is reducing the federal deficit to exactly 3% of GDP to stabilize the debt ratio and flatten the curve. Reaching this stabilization target requires expanding OBBA-style accountability, aggressively aligning price with outcomes across all federal sectors. A deficit of this scale turns ROI evaluation into a tool for preventing the fiscal crises predicted by the IMF and Moody's. Enforcing educational ROI functions as a fiscal instrument to reallocate capital and stabilize the national debt, while shielding students from unpayable loans.